We had Halloween this week, and it turns out that a bunch of kids in costumes were not the only ones out and about trick or treating. Let's get our headlines for the week from our panel and see what kind of tricks and treats we get from you guys. Patrick Svitek with the Texas Tribune. What's your headline for the week?
Deal or no deal on education priorities at the Texas Capitol.
And Scott Braddock with the Quorum Report. Scott, what's your headline for the week?
Special session seems to be crashing and burning.
Hey, let's stay with that, Scott. Governor Abbott school choice agreement unraveled just about as soon as he announced it. Was this a Halloween trick or a political double cross? What are you hearing?
Well, what I'm hearing is that it was just a Hail Mary by the governor. He's really desperate to pass his school choice initiative, which he has been campaigning on now for for at least 11 months, all year long, and a little bit before that as well during the primary last year. And he basically put out a statement that said there was a deal immediately. The speaker, his two negotiating partners on that, both said there wasn't a deal. The speaker said that they'd keep talking about it. And the very next day, the lieutenant governor said, well, hey, nobody checked with us. I think it's kind of cynical. I think that the governor was sort of betting that in the public's mind that his word would matter more than that of his negotiating partners. So he and his team probably think that that there are people who think there must have been a deal, and then the speaker and the lieutenant governor pulled out of it. But that doesn't seem to be the case.
Yeah, it's kind of strange because the governor indicated that he had some type of big comprehensive education package with money for schools, teachers, and his ESA plan. But Patrick, I never saw anything filed. What are you hearing?
Yeah, I would agree with Scott. I mean, it just seems like the governor was trying to create the perception or the appearance of momentum when there maybe wasn't that much momentum or any momentum really behind the scenes. And so he's clearly, very eager, desperate for some kind of progress on this at this point, and was maybe trying to force the House's hand.
You know, strange things certainly can happen under the Capitol Dome. Time at times can be suspended under the Capitol Dome. So, guys, it has happened before. So, can a deal still happen at this later date, Scott?
No, not on school vouchers, and the reason is that the votes just aren't there, and the votes aren't any different from what they were earlier in the year, going back to January, February, March, when there. You remember during the regular session there were some sort of test votes on school vouchers, and you had that in the form of a budget amendment that still enjoyed basically supermajority support. It was an amendment that opposes school vouchers, so there's still basically almost two-thirds of the House against school vouchers. There are 24 Republican members of the House, I'm told, who are just still hell no votes on this. Those are the ones who we told you before were the ones who started wearing the lapel pins that say 24 on them, that they're hanging tight and they're not going to vote for this. So if you do the math on that and you're kind to the governor, he still tops out around 60 votes for school choice, which isn't enough. He needs 76, and it's just not there.
Yeah, but the session doesn't end until Tuesday, and my Dick Tracy watch alarm hasn't gone off, Patrick. Come on, a deal can be made, right?
You never say never on something like this, but I agree it's very unlikely they can strike some kind of very, very, very unlikely they could strike some kind of deal and get it to the governor's desk by the end of this special session. Very likely that we're going to another special session where there may be a more singular focus on this issue. But we should note that even on some of the other items on the current special session agenda, some of the border security related items, we've seen some fighting break out between the House and the Senate. And so those issues are still unsettled as of this hour, too.
And teacher pay is still hanging in the balance once again. So it was a bargaining chip that the governor was using. I think a big miscalculation there, in my opinion. Democrats I've spoken to have said, hey, let's go ahead when there's another special session, if there's another special session, let's do that first. So, Scott, does it remain a bargaining chip, or does it finally get done, those teacher pay raises?
You know, it could have been a bargaining chip, but it was really done in the wrong way. The governor could have used leverage at the end of the process instead of the beginning. What could have happened, the Senate passed two different bills. That one of them dealt with school choice, the other one dealing with teacher pay and school finance. And what the governor could have done was say, look, if y'all pass both, I may veto one of them if you don't pass the other. So he could basically say that he'll kill all of it if one of those things doesn't pass. Instead, what he said was, I'm going to add teacher pay to the agenda after vouchers pass. And here's something that I think really caused a lot of Republican and Democrats too, but mainly Republicans who matter in this instance. A lot of Republicans just didn't take the governor seriously once he went ahead and put school finance and teacher pay on the agenda, even though his voucher bill hadn't passed. So it all year long, the governor's established sort of a pattern of having hollow threats and hollow promises. Remember earlier in the year, he also said there were certain bills that he had vetoed that could be, brought back to life if a property tax plan did pass. Well, that plan passed, but those bills never came back. They're not on the special session agenda. So whether it was threats or promises, the governor's just not following through.
The Senate did pass that teacher pay, one of the very first things, even though it wasn't on the call. So, Patrick, did the Democrats miscalculate on that? Shouldn't they? They didn't even take up the Senate teacher pay plan. Did they miss an opportunity there?
Honestly, since we're in special session, really it all comes down to what the governor is willing to sign. And as Scott pointed out, I mean, this teacher pay raise issue has been used as a bargaining chip. And as Scott also pointed out, the governor has been inconsistent in his bargaining and the parameters he set on this debate. And so it's really just become I think a huge mess. And Abbott, I think, as governor, has always struggled with managing the legislature, specifically the House, negotiating with the House, and it's really coming to a head, at this juncture.
Several key border security bills have also been caught up in this House-Senate stalemate. Patrick, you brought this up just a few moments ago. If there's anything that I think that can be saved before the deadline hits in Tuesday, maybe it's the $1.5 billion security bill. Do you agree with that?
It could. I mean, so they were able to get a bill toward Abbott's desks that increase penalties for human trafficking and stash house operations, but the two chambers are still divided on border security funding, and then also another proposal to create a state crime for illegal entry from a foreign nation. And so, we'll see if in these final days they can cobble together some kind of compromise. But based on the tenor of the criticism we saw between the two legislative leaders this week, I wouldn't hold your breath, and I would not be shocked if the next special session is not only about education, but still trying to finish the job on some of these border issues.
Yeah, the posting on social media was more like watching a bunch of eighth graders, right, Scott? Especially on that House bill with the extra security and the extra enforcement.
Yeah, look, I think that at this stage of the game, if you had the governor, the lieutenant governor, and the speaker all on the same page wanting to get something done, it could and would probably get done. But they're not on the same page at all. Not on school choice, not on border security. I started out, and Patrick, maybe you were in the same boat. I started out thinking that at least Republicans are going to find broad agreement on what they want to do, at least on one piece of border security legislation, that would happen. But now, in the last 24 hours, you've had Lieutenant Governor Patrick and the Speaker, Dade Phelan, at each other's throats. They actually, each of them called the other desperate yesterday as they were going back and forth about these border security measures, with the lieutenant governor saying that the speaker is desperate to sort of boost his conservative credentials, and the speaker saying that basically the lieutenant governor has lost all credibility on border security. So I'm not sure that they can get any of that stuff done. I would say that on border security, Republicans do feel under huge pressure from their primary voters to get something else done on border security. What exactly that looks like, it's really hard to hammer that out when these guys aren't getting along. So we'll find out by Tuesday.
The rhetoric, Patrick, on social media just seems so high school, middle school type. Does anything get resolved now?
Yeah, we'll see. And there's always a question of the timing of the next special session. My expectation is that it would be, immediately called. But in the past, we've seen kind of a quote unquote cooling off period in between special sessions. Right now, the way where I'm sitting, it doesn't look likely that we're going to have that long of a cooling off period. But we'll see. Obviously, tempers are flaring.
What do you think, Scott? A pre-Thanksgiving meal special session or leftovers after Thanksgiving?
We may see the House and Senate in session with the Christmas trees up in the middle of both chambers. That's very possible and hasn't happened in some time. But I do think it would be tone deaf on the governor's part to do that, because these folks, again, are just fighting in a way that does not create any sort of an environment to try to find an agreement on school vouchers. I mean, when Republicans are fighting with each other to the extent that they can't even agree that they need to pass something on immigration and border security, which is the issue that inflames their primary voters the most. I mean, that tells you what kind of environment this is. They're not getting along in any kind of a way. that would lead to collaboration on anything. And by the way, I've started to hear, and we reported this at quorumreport.com this week, that there are some Republican members of the House, and I don't even necessarily agree with this, but there are some of them who are starting to believe the governor doesn't even really want a voucher bill on his desk. And the reason they say that is because he's not doing anything you would do to actually make it happen. I think it's sort of it's the opposite, that he does want it to happen. He just doesn't know how to get it done. I think that's evidenced by his actions over the last 11 months.
The noise from Austin almost muted some big news coming out of D.C. Texas Congresswoman Kay Granger announcing Wednesday that she will not seek re-election after almost 3 decades in Congress. Patrick, is this the first GOP domino to drop, or is this just a reshuffling of the deck?
Well, Granger is a very senior member, 80 years old, has been in Congress for nearly 3 decades. And so I don't think it's necessarily surprising. I think she's one of probably only, if we have any further retirements in the Texas delegation, it'd probably be a very small amount. That being said, we have just seen this huge turmoil in House leadership and the changing of a guard at the top, having a new speaker in Mike Johnson. And so, I think that's the big asterisk on this is you have different members of the Texas delegation trying to game out kind of what their place is going to be in this new, newly led House Republican conference. And so that could be kind of the X factor here, but the clock is ticking. I mean, candidate filing, opens November 11th, which I believe is next week or the week after that, closes December 11th. And so anybody else in the Texas delegation who wants to hang it up has a pretty short timeline to figure it out.
Scott, does this put that Republican seat in jeopardy? Do the Democrats go after it? Can they get it?
I don't think so. That's a pretty solid Republican seat. I would say about Chair Granger's retirement is that, look, retirement is always a personal decision, whether that's in politics or in business. There's no set year when you have to do it. Although I will say that, for some people in business, the second they sign those Medicare papers, they probably don't want to work anymore. That's a case for a lot of folks. But the truth is, a person will often do something for their whole life if they really love it. We've seen where some lawmakers actually die in office, right? Because they continue on. I think on the Republican side right now, you do have some who will choose retirement because of some of the dynamics that Patrick is talking about with new leadership in Washington, leadership that some of the old guard in the Republican Party is probably, frankly, disgusted with. I think you could kind of see that on Chairwoman Granger's face as the votes were playing out to install yet another speaker in the House of Representatives in Washington. So I can't say it's shocking at all that she would leave.
Donald Trump returned to Texas holding a rally Thursday in Houston. Polls show that he still has a big lead in Texas. Guys, are the rest of the GOP candidates just writing off Texas? Is this a write-off, Scott?
I don't think that they have to play in Texas, but of course, remember that Texas is just one of many states in this contest. And years ago, in 2016, when Ted Cruz was in the race, Patrick, and you remember very well that Cruz was the one to win Texas, not Trump. I think that none of the other candidates are going to come close to Trump now in winning Texas. And I mean, the dynamic here, I know it's a little different from some other states at the presidential level, but let's be honest. Remember back in 2016 when there was sort of the grown-ups debate and then the kids table debate, because there were so many Republicans who were running. What we're seeing now at the national level is only the kids table debate because Trump's just not there. So he's so far out ahead of everybody else. I mean, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, trying to do what they can, and all of them just being shredded by Trump. They have their little moments here and there, but he's just such a dominant force that it's hard to say that they're writing it off. They may just be, in a situation where they can better spend their time in some smaller places.
The music group Alabama said if you want to play in Texas, you got to bring a fiddle to the band. Patrick, nobody's fiddling around in Texas.
I think it was Cruz who Ted Cruz parodied that, I think, in his 2018 reelection.
All right.
campaign.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think people like Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley are going to keep coming back for fundraising in Texas. But in terms of actually trying to win the Texas primary, I don't think you're going to see a robust effort from them. For the non-Trump candidates like DeSantis and Haley, they're almost exclusively focused on the earlier voting states right now, especially Iowa. I think their strategy is to try to stop Trump there, and then they'll reset and think about a strategy in Texas. But stopping Trump, as we can all acknowledge, is a very hard endeavor at this point if you look at the polling.
Governor Greg Abbott taking a trip to Israel with the governor of Oklahoma. He says it was to show support for Israel after the October 7th terror attack. Scott, is this all it was, or was he checking an important political box, maybe jumping into a political race, federal race? pretty soon.
Everything that Abbott's been focused on lately has been, a national issue of, one color or another. I mean, he's trying to show solidarity with Israel. That's a winning issue politically, especially in a Republican primary and in other venues as well. But he's also largely focused on school choice, as we've talked about, and on the border. These are all national themes. I found that, look, I think the timing of the trip is really what's interesting. As his special session is going out with a whimper, it seems, as we've been talking about earlier, he gets out of town. And I think that, the political calculation there could very well be that he and his consultant, Dave Carney, got together and said, where could we go that's thousands of miles from the Texas Capitol and no Republican would criticize you for going? And so that's where they are.
Was this all about getting out of the kitchen while it was hot, Patrick?
Look, to a national general Republican audience, I think this is totally politically safe territory. But to the Republicans inside the legislature, I think it plays differently, even if you haven't heard them publicly criticize him over it, especially given that right before the trip, he announced this quasi deal and then
Mhm.
left town. So, I don't think it really did anything to help him with those Republicans who he needs inside the legislature, who are critical to, the passage of any school voucher education plan.
For Ken Paxton, safe territory certainly isn't a courtroom, and we do know now that a courtroom is in his future. April set for his security fraud case. Guys, we were talking about this earlier. Does it actually go to trial, Scott?
Well, it's set for trial finally. It's going to happen in April, according to the judge who announced that this week. There are some things to clear up, as far as the prosecutor pay and all of that. And I think that they're moving that along as well. But this is a long time coming. Remember, this goes back to when Paxton was first elected as Attorney General, going all the way back to 2014 when these accusations of securities fraud were first leveled against him. He's been under indictment the entire time that he's been Attorney General. And I think that while he feels like he's sort of riding high. And I wonder what Patrick, thought about it since he saw him in the courtroom. But he probably thinks he's riding high after he came out of that impeachment trial with an acquittal. But of all of the issues, whether it was in the Senate or in courtrooms around the state, the impeachment was the least of his legal worries. He could have been removed from office in that proceeding, but he could face jail time. He could be in the TDCJ in prison if he's convicted, I think for up to 99 years on the charges that he's facing in Houston. And of course, we have also heard about, federal investigators, the FBI looking into him as well. I would think that would be the thing that he'd be worried about the most.
This is the time that deals start being made between prosecutors and defense attorneys. Patrick, you've been watching this real close. Does a deal get made? Does it go down to a lesser maybe charge?
Yeah, so the special prosecutors were asked about the potential for a deal, outside the courtroom on Monday morning, and they said they're not involved, a party to any discussions like that at this point. Like Scott pointed out, I mean, this is serious stuff, and it's finally set for trial. There's still, I think, some procedural landmines that could upend, the ultimate trial date. The prosecutor pay issue, while it was ruled in favor of them this week, I could still see some things there that cause further disruption and potentially delay. But it's really serious, and it's a reminder that even though he was acquitted in the Senate impeachment trial, he still has significant legal exposure on this issue, on the whistleblower claims. You not only have that federal investigation on the whistleblower claims, but you have a civil lawsuit, a whistleblower lawsuit moving forward. So, the trials and tribulations of Ken Paxton continue.
And with that, let's wrap up this week with one word, and we'll start with Patrick. What is your word for this week?
I'll go back to my headline and just use deal.
Scott, close us out with a word.
With a whimper.
And with that, we're wrapping up another week in Texas politics.